Well, good evening, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here. And thanks to Michael Byrne and the Offaly History Society for arranging this. I'm going to talk. I wrote this book, Irish General Practice: A Long Story, and it starts. I'm going to quote a small amount. It starts there. Here is Conla Machanlaga introducing himself. I am Conla Machanlaga, and I am in Killaracht, attending on Tomalacht, son of Cian, son of Owen, who has had his foot dangerously wounded by Cormac, son of Brian Og o Art, the Monday following the Sunday of the Cross. It is today, and the 14th of the moon, and the age of our Lord is 1509. Now, the book goes on and it ends in 2024 with the 40th anniversary of the Irish College of General Practitioners. So that's a fairly long span, too long to cover in one night. And so I have taken one of the chapters and I'm going to talk about that, about a specific time in Tullamore Jail in 1879. And so the other book, incidentally, that I used, and I've acknowledged it here, is Larry Geary's book, The Land War in Ireland, Famine, Philanthropy and Moonlighting. That's only recently published, and it's an excellent book on this period. Okay, that's enough about books. Let's turn to some less permanent ephemera. Some years ago, on a visit to Purcell's auctions in Birr, I came across a rather interesting address from the Galway Town Commissioners to George Alexander Moorhead on the occasion of his marriage to a Galway girl on September the 25th, 1890. And that's it. And when I looked at it, I didn't actually buy it, but I looked at it, and afterwards, when I realised I should have bought it, I got permission through Connor from the purchaser to use it in the book. The address, I'll just read it to you. It says, on behalf of the Corporation of Galway Town Commissioners, we desire to express to you our sense of the services you have rendered your country by the vigilant watch you kept upon the doings of deft jailers when they were making attempts on the lives of our best friends incarcerated under the Coercion Act. We shall not readily forget how you exposed the dark devices resorted to upon political prisoners in Tullamore Jail, at a time when atrocities of the most odious character were committed by the instruments of the government. If the political prisoner, guilty of no offence but one which should entitle him to public gratitude, is treated in the jails of today with more humanity and more decency, if the public mind is not shocked now with accounts of savage scenes in the dark interior of the jails, if the political prisoner is not now an ordinary criminal, we aver that the result is to a great extent due to the fearless manner in which you, sir, in season and out of season, directed public attention to the villainies perpetuated 2 years ago in Tullamore Jail. So what on earth is all this about? What I want to show you in the next 30, 40 minutes or so is how an old object like this can unlock a human drama hiding in the history of our own town. But first, let me offer a brief background lesson on the health services available at that time. And this is just purely context, but probably necessary context. Okay, that's the document. Okay. Now, this slide, it starts in the medieval times with the monasteries and priories and abbeys, and most of them had infirmaries. which the poor could seek for succour. But after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, there was a hiatus. Almost overnight, the monastic infirmaries just disappeared. But gradually, over the next century, almshouses were established by philanthropic individuals. The Shee Almshouse in Kilkenny, some of you may know, was built by Richard Shee in 1582, and 2 years later, Stephen Skiddy in Cork left a bequest for an almshouse after the death of his wife, which occurred in 1606. And Richard Boyle, first Earl of Cork, built an almshouse in Youghal in 1613. Now, at the end of the 17th century, as the population expanded and conflict and periodic famine drove the rural poor to seek refuge in towns and cities, begging and vagrancy became major social issues there. The answer was the building of houses of industry in the larger cities, Dublin being the first. That grim institution in St. James's, you can see up here, in James's Street, where the poor and unwanted were locked up, is now the site of St. James's Hospital, the largest and most modern hospital in the state. It certainly will be when the Children's Hospital eventually opens its doors. Yeah. A measure, perhaps, of the distance we have come since those bleak times. These institutions provided some sick relief while introducing a policy of punishment for destitution, something that would be developed further in the 19th century workhouses. Basic sick relief was provided, but people certainly did not go into these places for sick relief. The founding hospitals, I've just put that up there, the founding hospitals began a little later. These institutions accepted infants and children, the majority of whom died, and those that lived were brought up in the Protestant religion, something that was greatly resented by the Catholic population. Now, not long after the first houses of industry were built, a number of doctors got together in Dublin and opened the first charitable infirmary in Jervis Street in 1718. And 2 years later, the North Charitable Infirmary in Cork opened its gates. These city-based infirmaries, unlike the houses of industry, were intended to cure the sick and were entirely supported by voluntary subscriptions. The one in Cork was actually supported by the Cork Musical Society, which I think is quite apt given the wonderful Messiah concert we had last night. Yeah, so subscribers paid a guinea a year, and for this money they were able to send one patient at a time for treatment. This system reinforced the social hierarchy, keeping the poor in their place and elevating the social standing of the subscribers. These city infirmaries were simply too far away to benefit the rural sick poor. So to address this problem, the County Infirmary Act was passed in 1765, and this provided an infirmary in nearly every county in the country and was the first attempt at a national hospital service in the British Isles, coming quite a number of decades before anything similar happened in Britain. The County Infirmary of the King's County was based initially in Philipstown, but soon moved to Tullamore as a more central location in the country. And this brings another point about these county infirmaries. The roads in Ireland at that time were absolutely appalling. So there's one lovely quote here. This is from the Clonmel surgeon Dennis Phelan. He remarked in the 1830s that sending patients to Mallow Infirmary from Mill Street or Kanturk was, and I quote, as if that institution was in Constantinople or at the western side of the Atlantic Ocean. The dispensaries were a partial answer to this problem. These were small local surgeries manned by a doctor and an apothecary who would dispense medicine in situ or on home visits. Their services were free to those who obtained a ticket from a subscriber. So the system was still the same. You had to get a ticket from one of the gentry or a wealthy merchant, whoever was a subscriber. A red one got you a home visit, known as a scarlet runner, and a black one got you a dispensary visit. Initially, these dispensaries were charitable institutions run by management committees elected by a group of local voluntary subscribers with a strong gentry element. In 1805, the Dispensary Act was passed that allowed managers of these voluntary dispensaries to apply for a grand jury grant equal to the amount of the voluntary subscriptions. So thus, at a stroke, the management committees could double their money. And this was very much to their liking, because in the succeeding decades, dispensaries sprang up all over the country, wherever there were sufficient wealthy individuals to make up a viable pool of voluntary subscribers. And their motives were not entirely altruistic, because private practice was allowed. So by establishing a dispensary, managers and subscribers could provide for their own health needs at local level. And here we see another historical fact that has echoed through the centuries to the present day. In Ireland, private and public medical practice have always been inextricably linked. So by the opening years of the 19th century, we had city infirmaries and houses of industry. We had smaller county infirmaries and a nationwide patchwork of dispensaries, all run by voluntary management committees elected by subscribers. The vast majority were Protestants, since most landed wealth was in Protestant hands. And because the dispensary doctor also provided private medical care to the gentry of his district, the subscribers tended to appoint Protestant doctors and Protestant apothecaries. Here I might allude in passing to Loam Attil, who, as a young man, became the first dispensary doctor of the Geishel dispensary. That was founded in 1828, and Attil wrote a memoir of his time in Geishel and went on to become president of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland. So doctors could use these dispensaries as springboards for later careers. The next important milestone was the Poor Law of 1838. This divided the country into 90 poor law unions with a workhouse in each union. During the Great Famine, the workhouses were overwhelmed. Sickness was rife. Fever, as much as actual starvation, was a great killer. Each workhouse had its own infirmary, and during the 1840s and 50s, these grew so fast that they soon eclipsed the county infirmaries in size and number. Many, including Tullamore, had a fever hospital attached at the back. During these years, those in Dublin and Cork became enormous. However, the great medical lesson of the famine was that it demonstrated that the charity system was no longer fit for purpose. So in 1851, the government passed the Medical Charities Act, which allowed the poor law guardians to take over ailing dispensaries and county infirmaries and run them under poor law local taxation. Many poor law guardians were Catholic merchants who refused to stand over Protestant jobbery. The guardians' meetings were open to the press and were reported widely. All this led to change in middle century, with the newspapers leading the charge. I might say again, just in passing, that these meetings of the guardians are the most marvellous source of local political life in the 19th century. Read the book. The King's County dispensaries. Now let's just look at these. These were the range of dispensaries on the left-hand side in the King's County, and on the right-hand side, the situation in Tullamore. By the 1880s, when the curtain rises on this drama, Tullamore had its own county infirmary, its own workhouse infirmary, and its dispensary. And Kings County as a whole had a network of 10 dispensaries dispersed throughout the towns of the county, as you can see there. Tullamore had a county infirmary with a fever hospital in the rear, a dispensary in the high street, here, which is still there today, smartly painted, demonstrating to one and all that Tullamore is a self-confident town on the up. And incidentally, many of these old buildings, of course, also had on the left the county jail, but more of that later. Many of these old buildings, these dispensary buildings, sometimes neglected but often restored and repurposed, are still to be found in towns and villages throughout the country. And I remember encouraging the GPs at the book launch of this book to hunt these out, these old buildings. Because sometimes they have plaques written on them with all sorts of things and tributes to their dispensary doctors. And there's a lot of history around the place still in front of our eyes if we know how to look. Now, the dramatis personae, there are 5 people involved in this tale. I have photographs of 4, but not the 5th, James Ridley. So we have 2 Irish nationalists, we have 2 Tullamore doctors, and a wily politician in the form of Arthur Balfour. I have pictures of 4 of them, but unable to find a picture of Ridley, which is a pity really, because Dr. James Ridley is really the anti-hero of this tale. So the build-up. What happened in Tullamore had its roots in the land war of the 1880s, and the famine of 1879-80 provided the spark. This second 19th century famine has been covered comprehensively by Geary in his book, and is interesting to us today, not so much because of any disastrous loss of life, because there wasn't, or because of its duration, which turned out to be short, but because of the response which it generated across the world. That response was vastly different to that in the 1840s. For the first time, the Irish diaspora really made itself felt. Donations flooded in from Australia, New Zealand, the US and Canada, amounting to £1 million. The British government, which is not often stressed, spent a further £2 million on a range of relief measures. Charles Stewart Parnell went to America to raise money for relief and garner popular support for land reform. So by 1887, things had got so bad and the agitation had got so dangerous that the government feared it might lose its grip. In response to this dangerous situation, Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, sent his nephew to Ireland as Chief Secretary to enforce the Criminal Law and Procedures Ireland Act of 1887, commonly called the Crimes Act. The Act provided for arrest and imprisonment without trial for a range of agitation offences. Salisbury's nephew was the 39-year-old Arthur Balfour at the beginning of his long political career. The way Salisbury put it was, the Irish needed to take a licking before appeasement will do them any good. Barbara Tushman, in her book Bible and Sword, 1956, describes Balfour in the following terms, and I quote, "Cynical is a word used of Mr. Balfour by people who knew him, almost as often as they try to describe his charm, which left everyone feeling happy who talked with him. He had a profound and philosophic mind. He was lazy, imperturbable in any fracas, shunned detail, left facts to subordinates, played tennis whenever possible, but pursued his principles of statecraft with every art of politics under the command of a superb intelligence." Balfour's arrival in Dublin coincided with the launch of the Plan of Campaign, a rent strike aimed at landlords who raised rents and evicted non-payers. Clauses in the Crimes Act were aimed directly at organisers of the plan of campaign, e.g. conspiracies against the payment of rent, boycotting, intimidation, unlawful assembly, resistance to eviction, and the inciting of others to any of these crimes. The first test of the Crimes Act came when John Mandeville and William O'Brien, MP, organised a boycott of the Kingston estate at Mitchelstown Castle in County Cork. Am I still on the right? Yep. On the 9th and 11th of August 1887, Mandeville and O'Brien launched a rent strike and urged the crowds to resist any attempt by the Dowager Countess of Kingston to evict any tenant for non-payment of rents. Both men ignored the summons to Mitchelstown Petty Sessions, and both were convicted in their absence and sentenced to 2 and 3 months' imprisonment in Cork City Jail. Doesn't sound much, but wait till you see what happened. They were, of course, caught. And on their first night, they demanded political status and refused to wear prison clothing or do menial tasks. Determined not to be humiliated by the two prisoners and their supporters, Balfour had them transferred to Tullamore jail. Balfour later told his Under-Secretary, Sir Joseph West Ridgway, that Tullamore was chosen on the grounds that both doctor and governor were specially to be relied on. William O'Brien described Tullamore as one of the worst prisons in the country. Moorheads and Ridleys. So let's look at the two medical families who got tied up in this. The prison doctor James Ridley was from a Protestant family who had been prominent in Tullamore's 19th century development and in the history of its county infirmary. His uncle John Ridley, had been the infirmary surgeon before him, and he, John, had been appointed on the retirement of George Pearce, John's father-in-law, who had been appointed in 1817. So the post of medical director surgeon of the county infirmary had already been in the Pearce-Ridley family for 58 years before his own appointment in 1875. When the prison was completed in 1835, the post of prison infirmary doctor was added to the duties of the medical director of the county infirmary. So, one person, two jobs. The Tullamore Workhouse received its first inmates in 1842. It had an infirmary and fever hospital from day one, and the medical officer was Michael Moorhead. Michael Moorhead's son, George Alexander, of the address from Galway Town Commissioners, he took over from his father and held the post till his death in 1934. So the Moorhead family held the workhouse infirmary post for a combined total of 92 years. Moorhead and Ridley, Catholic and Protestant, workhouse and county infirmaries. This was Tullamore in the 1870s. Ridley had another job too. You can see here that he was the medical officer of the Tullamore Union Dispensary District. In other words, the Tullamore Dispensary. And that poster is written there by order of George Ridley, Honorary Secretary of the Tullamore Union. That's the union, the Board of Guardians of Tullamore. George Ridley was the secretary. So you can see the Ridleys really had the thing wrapped up. At 10 a.m. on the 2nd of November 1887, Mandeville and O'Brien arrived at Tullamore Prison, O'Brien's worst prison in Ireland. Their first action of protest was to refuse to wear prison clothing, refusing to comply, as they put it, with the degrading rules of ordinary criminals. When Balfour heard this, he remarked, and I quote, "Absurdly trifling as the matter seems, it has really now been magnified into an important incident in the struggle between the National League and the government, and I should be sorry if anything gave cause even for the smallest triumph to the wrong side." End quote. Fanshawe, the prison governor, was hauled in front of Balfour to be inspired with some trace of vigour and initiative. On his return to Tullamore, both prisoners were put on bread and water for 24 hours. And since the only effect of the treatment was a bout of diarrhoea in both prisoners, the governor called in the visiting justices who had wider powers of punishment. However, by this time, O'Brien was losing weight, so the justices accepted Ridley's recommendation that he be sent to the prison infirmary. While he slept, his own clothes were removed, and he woke to see prison clothing by his bed. Nationalists in Britain and Ireland were outraged, and Tullamore became the focus of public controversy. Resolutions flooded in from church bodies and boards of guardians, culminating in a big nationalist demonstration in Leinster Hall in Dublin on the 24th of November. The Lord Mayor of Dublin presided, 6 English MPs and more than a score of Irish ones attended, and the Catholic archbishops of Dublin, Cashel and Tuam, as well as several bishops, publicly expressed their sympathy with the declared aims of the meeting. Mandeville and O'Brien had become international celebrities. So far, so good for the plan of campaign. Now, courtesy of the Illustrated London News, we can take a peek inside Tullamore Jail at this time. And we can see a number of things here. We can see, I'm not sure what that is, it's Mandeville or O'Brien, but anyway, this man here swathed in his bedding because his clothes have been taken away. Here is Mandeville, bottom left, being stripped of his clothing. And here he is above that on a wooden plank bed. But this cell, it was open to the prison yard and an ill-fitting door, and so we're in November, remember, 1887, and it's bloody cold. So in the prison, things were getting worse. Up to this point, Ridley's role had been minor and benign. By moving O'Brien to the prison infirmary, Dr. Ridley had suspended further punishment, except, of course, the removal of his clothes, which presumably was the decision of the governor or the justices. For some reason, however, Ridley's approach to Mandeville seems to have been different. Dr. Moorhead, as doctor, public health official, and local magistrate, and a supporter of the nationalist cause, visited both men in prison. And on his second visit, on November the 12th, he noticed Mandeville's breathing was embarrassed, is the way he put it, and his throat was inflamed. He recommended he be removed to the infirmary. Instead, Ridley certified him fit to undergo further punishment, and he was put on bread and water for 3 days. Meanwhile, public outrage was mobilised in Ireland and England. On the 13th of November, a full-blown riot took place in Trafalgar Square. But this made little difference to the treatment of the prisoners. After his release, Mandeville said this of Ridley, and I quote, "He was such a curious man. I never could understand him. Though he was so uneasy about my health that after this he visited me twice a day for some time, ordered medicine for my diarrhoea and a gargle for my throat, which was very painful. He never made the slightest change in my food, except substituting white bread for brown, and though knowing the exhausted state I was in and the disease from which I suffered, he never ordered me as much as a cup of milk." End quote. I put all this stuff on the left-hand side just to show that in this short space of 2 months, Mandeville was moved from his cell. Well, I don't know whether he was in there's a special punishment cell or not. I don't know about that. But he was moved onto this bread and water regime constantly. And even though, we had riots and everything, they just kept at him. Moorhead, meanwhile, was a constant visitor. I think it's something like 13 times he visited the hospital, the prison, while Mandeville was there. Again, Moorhead recommended he be moved to the infirmary, and again this was refused. This time, the medical member of the General Prisons Board pronounced him in vigorous health. Moorhead now began to leak reports of the prisoner's treatment to the national newspapers. His report of O'Brien, sitting in his cell, swathed only in his bedding, was particularly inflaming. So that is this one here. And obviously the London Illustrated News took that report and used it to develop a kind of centerpiece for this. So the governor then ordered that Mandeville's clothing, Mandeville's clothing has already been removed. Four warders approached in the night. And there again, this one, we can see them here. 4 warders approached in the night. The prisoner was ordered to strip, and when he refused, his clothes were forcibly removed. One warder said he only slightly resisted, while another said the scene reminded him of the Jews stripping of our Lord. This was followed by the removal of his bedclothes. Only then did he don the prison uniform left behind by the warders the previous night. Protesting against this, Mandeville refused to clean out his cell and was again put on bread and water. Now, there's a terrible echo here backwards through history of the hunger strikes and the dirty protest in Belfast in the 1980s. So national outrage again went up a notch. The Freeman's Journal reported, and I quote, "Outrage, shameless, brutal, dastardly treatment, an act of peculiar baseness. He was soon overpowered by sheer brute force and stripped of every shred of his clothes. Mr. Balfour's clothes snatchers complete their task and leave Mr. Mandeville stark naked during a dark November night in a tile-floored cell. As infamous and barbarous an outrage upon personal liberty and freedom as anything recorded in modern despots." End quote. Moorhead, on his next visit, reported the cell was close, dirty, and offensive smelling, from the presence of excreta not removed. The prolongation of such a situation, he said, would break down the constitution of the strongest man and would probably develop into a malignant type of disease in Mr. Mandeville's case. All this treatment was firmly laid at Balfour's door, but he remained implacable. In fact, he became more entrenched. He sent James Barr of Kirkdale Prison, Dr. James Barr of Kirkdale Prison, Liverpool, to strengthen Ridley's weakening resolve. Barr was described later by Mandeville's solicitor as a confirmed puppy of the most malignant type. Barr examined Mandeville and found him a strong, healthy, rather corpulent man, considerably over the average weight for men of his height. 2 days later, he was put back on bread and water for 24 hours. Moorhead again visited him on the 29th of November and found him chilled from dietary punishment and suffering from a tremor in his hands after 4 days in his cell without exercise. Let's go back to this one. Moorhead insisted that Mandeville needed proper exercise and demanded a relaxation of prison rules, and this time he was heeded. Rather than be seen to concede to Mandeville however, or to Moorhead, the government ruled that all Crimes Act prisoners should henceforth be permitted to exercise separately from other prisoners. This was a massive climb down. Balfour protested, but Balfour was overruled by London. It was greeted in Ireland by great rejoicing. Mandeville's wife Mary saw it as a great triumph for her husband. By this time it seems that Birr had taken over from Ridley in the management of the two troublesome prisoners, and on the 5th of December he deemed Mandeville fit to undergo further punishment and confined him for another 48 hours on bread and water. On the 14th of December he was again examined by Birr, who said that, apart from a slight attack of diarrhoea, the prisoner's health was good. 6 days later, with less than a week of his sentence to run, he was again confined to a cell on bread and water for 48 hours. The dates were the 22nd and 23rd of December. On the following day, Christmas Eve, 1887, he was released. Nationalist Ireland erupted in celebration. The route from Knocklyon railway station to Mitchelstown was lit by bonfires. One reporter described the scene, and I quote, "The procession was headed by a regiment of mounted men some 100 strong, their steeds gaily caparisoned. Then came a long line of cars with tar barrels blazing in the rear. On approaching Mitchelstown, the procession was met by the whole population, which turned out en masse. Every house in the town was brilliantly illuminated. Arches were suspended across the streets, and the town was decorated with great taste and artistic merit." In assessing Mandeville's treatment, we need to understand that his prison had none of the comforts we associate with prisons today. He slept on this planked bed fixed to the wall. The stone-tiled floor was cold and damp. The ill-fitting door opened onto the yard and offered little protection from the biting winter wind. He was subjected to far more punishment than other prisoners at that time. In Dr. Moorhead's view, such treatment was calculated to undermine the constitution of the strongest man. 6 months later, on the 8th of July, 1888, after months of declining health and a heavy program of public speaking, John Mandeville died of diffuse cellular inflammation of the throat. In the intervening months since his release, the RIC had deployed their agents to track his movements, and after his death and before the inquest, they did their best to blacken his name. Moorhead, who more than anyone else understood how his prison experience had affected the prisoner's health, pulled no punches. His testimony, coupled with the fact that Dr. Birr grossly overplayed his hand, saying that Mandeville, could you believe it, was a great scoundrel who deserved all he got. This persuaded the jury, after only 35 minutes, to find, and I quote again, "Mandeville's death was directly linked to his prison treatment. In the first of two riders, the government's policy of treating Irish political prisoners as common criminals was censured, as was the severity of the methods used to enforce prison regulations. Finally, the jury deprecated the vile aspersions cast by Dr. Birr on Mandeville's personal physicians." End quote. One further factor may have swayed the jury. On the night before he was due to give evidence, James Ridley locked the door of his hotel room in Fermoy, took his own razor and cut his throat. His body was found by James Birr the following morning in a pool of congealed blood. A timid physician and surgeon to the end, he had not made a clean job of it. If we move to Ridley's inquest, we have contested evidence all over the place. And I've put some of these on the screen here. Possibly they're a bit small to read, but I'll go through it. At his own inquest, some months later, several witnesses referred to the mental strain under which he had operated during the closing months of his life. This is Ridley. and traced its origins to the appearance of Dr. Moorhead's leaked reports on Mandeville's condition in the nationalist press. The prison governor testified that he had heard Ridley say, "I am ruined. I will lose all my private practice." Ridley's subsequent loss of public credit and private practice, allegedly caused by Moorhead, an allegation that Moorhead vigorously denied, made him depressed and nervous, and a lack of sleep caused him to take on a haggard and worried look. The nationalist viewpoint was that he was a sensitive, nervous, and weak individual who had been driven by fear of his superiors to act contrary to his own humane inclinations and medical propriety. The jury returned a unanimous verdict that James Ridley had committed suicide while labouring under temporary insanity produced by the apprehensions of disclosures at the Mitchelstown inquest, and concluded that he was compelled to act in his official capacity in contravention to his own humane and considerate views. Timothy Harrington, who had represented the Mandeville family at that inquest, confirmed this view, and I quote, "We can see from his prescription book that he was treating Mandeville as a sick man almost every day since his imprisonment began, but yet the unfortunate fellow had not the courage to order him to hospital." So here are some of the other quotes from the Ridley inquest, and you just get the sense of how contested it really was. William O'Brien remembered Ridley saying that from the first time he heard we were coming to Tullamore, he had a haunting feeling that it would end badly. William O'Brien also observed that every official seemed to be under a superstitious terror of the power of the prisons board, Mr. Balfour, or somebody in Dublin Castle. On the other hand, George Ridley, James Ridley's father, visiting justice to Tullamore prison, said that his only son had earned a comfortable living of £400 to £500 from private practice and several offices. These were county infirmary surgeon, prison surgeon, dispensary doctor, constabulary physician, and whenever it became necessary, he officiated as military surgeon as well. So, what is this? 4 or 5 jobs, all of them carrying salaries and private practice. So one is left wondering with James Ridley, if he said he'd be ruined because of the loss of private practice, he would still have had all his state salaries. Was he a man who was living beyond his means? I think Michael was saying to me earlier that his wife, his widow, had to look for some help as well. So there's something perhaps we don't fully know about Ridley. Arthur Balfour, on the other hand, he admired the fiery Dr. Birr, but told Ridgway, his Under-Secretary, that the doctor's evidence was exciting the wrath of the nationalist members to a most alarming degree. A most amusing degree. But it might destroy his usefulness to us on future occasions. Dr. George P. Ridley, James Ridley's cousin and dispensary colleague, he saw his cousin as a man of delicate, sensitive nature and a strong sense of duty. Their joint practice had been damaged by people staying away and people who groaned at James in public. Dr. George P. Ridley, incidentally, was succeeded by Dr. Moorhead as dispensary surgeon. A sergeant remembered Ridley as saying that people spat on him in the streets. George Moorhead, who as magistrate had the right to visit Tullamore jail, and he did so on 13 occasions, Moorhead saw the prisoner undergo bread and water punishment and said it might not produce a fatal, but it was calculated to produce a pernicious effect on his constitution. Moorhead repeatedly advised that Mandeville should be removed to hospital, which he was not. But when asked at the inquest of Ridley Whether he had ever passed on his recommendations to Dr. James Ridley, Moorhead said he had not. Captain Featherstone Haw, or Fanshawe, as I think he probably would have called himself, the prison governor, had heard Ridley say, "I am ruined, I will lose all my practice." The governor claimed he had never pushed Ridley to declare prisoners fit for punishment, adding, "He was the most attentive to his duties as prison surgeon, and also as surgeon to the county infirmary, of which I am also governor." So all this suggests Ridley to me as a person who was kind of caught in a multi-armed vice. Wherever he turned, he found the people he was superior to controlling him, really. In her paper, The Irish Prison Doctors, Men in the Middle, 1865-90, Beverly Smith in 1982 concluded thus. I mentioned her name at the very beginning of this talk. "The government, intent on quelling unrest, insisted that the nationalists be treated as ordinary or common criminals. As a part of their duties, prison doctors could exempt any prisoner from the ordinary regime. By not exempting them, nationalists and their followers could attack the doctors' reputations and boycott their practices. But if the doctors did exempt them, then the government could remove them from their prison posts and deny them other positions. These individual prison doctors were thus men in the middle." So just quickly to wrap this up, the survivors. We started with 5 dramatis personae, and now we only have 3. William O'Brien was 35 at the time of his imprisonment in Tullamore. He was an MP at the time, which may explain why he was treated less brutally than his friend. He went on to play an important part in Ireland's independence story, but died a disappointed man. His vision of Ireland was an inclusive one. On the 15th of September 1914, during the House of Commons debate on suspending Home Rule for the duration of the war, he stood up and said, "While we are prepared to pay almost any other price for a general national settlement, there is one price that some of us, at all events, will never in any possible circumstances consent to pay, and that is the dismemberment of our ancient Irish nation." William O'Brien died in 1928, living long enough to see his dearest hopes dashed. Perhaps in the forlorn hope that a whole island, Ireland, could be salvaged from the wreckage of the new state, he supported the anti-treaty side in the Civil War and De Valera in the years that remained to him. George Moorhead continued with his medical practice, loved and respected by all, or perhaps we should say by all Catholics. As that address from Galway Town Commissioners so well attests, it seems that Shakespeare's picture of old age as honour, love, obedience and troops of friends did indeed accompany George Moorhead into his final years. 84 cars formed the funeral cortege that crawled the 4 miles from the Church of the Assumption to Durrow Cemetery on a rainy Sunday in August 1934. The medical press and circular described him as careful in all his work, kindly to the poor, upright in all his conduct both with the public and with his professional brethren. He was one of that class of country doctors who by competence and character have done most to maintain the reputation and dignity of the Irish medical profession. The British Medical Journal, not to be outdone, added its own unique coda. He had a keen interest in horse breeding and kept his best strains of thoroughbred in his stud in Tullamore. Arthur Balfour was undoubtedly the wicked witch from the east in this affair. However, having administered his uncle's licking to the nationalists, He went on to introduce the Congested Districts Board, which, probably for the first time in the troubled history between the two islands, introduced beneficial social change to the poorest of the poor in rural Ireland, and opened the way to the ultimate victory of nationalists in the land war. One is left, therefore, pondering Barbara Tushman's description of him as cynical, lazy, charming, imperturbable, and utterly brilliant at the dark arts of statecraft. That's it. Thank you.